Today, I would like to invite you to reflect upon Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. This speech was given in 1963. It is one of the most famous and at the same time fundamental speeches given in American history. Let us go over this speech with calm thoughtfulness. We will look at each sentence and discuss slowly, thoroughly. Why do I suggest this method of calm and slow reflection? Well, first, Martin Luther King's speech is structured in, I think it is safe to say, a traditionally condensed format, traditional by American standards. The great orators, the great rhetoric in American political history has represented many different types of content. However, its form, I believe, has been almost universally taught. Part of the reason for this is because in a self-governing republic, in a democratic society, it is necessary for opinion leadership, for those with any political ambition, to be mindful of their vast, diverse audience, to be more succinct. Viewers and listeners may therefore wonder why I, in my reflections, opt for obviously a form that is the opposite of the American rhetorical tradition. Well, I think that while it is true that in political life, rhetoric must match rhetoric, there is also a place and a need and a time for deeper political reflection. Political philosophy cannot be rhetorical. Plato's Gorgias teaches us this much. Let us begin. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Here, both in language, in structure, and in direct allusion, Martin Luther King places himself squarely within the historical tradition of Abraham Lincoln. This seems to suggest that Martin Luther King places himself within the tradition of a radical American idealism. However, if indeed Abraham Lincoln was a great American, and he was, and if indeed Martin Luther King places himself directly in the tradition of Abraham Lincoln, we must not fail to recognize that Abraham Lincoln was not, in practice and in theory, an idealist of the sort that is associated with impractical radicalism. Lincoln pursued radical goals with cold pragmatism. This is one reason why many of Lincoln's critics blame him for hypocrisy. It is interesting that those who were Lincoln's greatest enemies considered him a tyrant. Lincoln, of course, in his Lyceum address, foretold and foreshadowed that a citizenry, a republic that placed some radical idea above the rule of law was bound for tyranny and would require a tyrant to rescue it. This irony maybe is lost upon those who accuse Lincoln of Caesarism or tyranny. But on the other hand, there are those who accuse Lincoln of a kind of dishonesty, a kind of hypocrisy. The fact that Lincoln put the preservation of the Union and the Constitution above the goals of the abolitionists who wished to see simply the end of slavery immediately are the roots or the root cause of this accusation. So we may ask, why does Martin Luther King not make this accusation? Why does he stand directly in the historical tradition of Abraham Lincoln? Let us keep that question open and continue. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of hope to millions of slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. A beacon of hope, but not of ultimate relief. This is a very important point. Notice that Martin Luther King defines the Emancipation Proclamation, the document which ended slavery in America, as a beacon of hope. A beacon of hope, something hoped for, is something on the horizon, not in hand. Therefore, Martin Luther King clearly believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was not the end of a problem, but the beginning to a solution. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. So again, if we consider the dawn, sunrise, daybreak, the beginning of the day, if we consider the day, the beginning of the day, as the beginning of work, the beginning of a journey towards the day's goals. Again, the joyous daybreak, the beacon of hope, all of this language suggests that the Emancipation Proclamation was not the end of a problem, but the beginning to a solution. But 100 years later, the colored America is still not free. This statement is a very radical statement because it is being made by a wise, intelligent, learned man who knows the weight of the words he uses. To say that colored America is still not free is logically to say that colored America is still enslaved. Because, simply put, if you are not free, what are you? What is a slave except one who is not free? We must remember the context within which these words were spoken. The legal and political idea of separate but equal was the underpinning, the foundation for segregation. This idea suggested that it was possible for two human beings of different color to be forced into a separate existence, but within each of those separate lives, within each of those separate worlds, they would theoretically be guaranteed the same liberties. According to Martin Luther King, such an idea is, while certainly different from the idea and practice of slavery, still not freedom. The question is important. What does Martin Luther King mean when in the same paragraph he tells us of the Emancipation Proclamation, which most people would say is defined as giving freedom to the slaves. But Martin Luther King tells us that it only gives them hope, daybreak. They are not yet free. These are very powerful accusations. Accusations made, as Martin Luther King claims, in the tradition of Abraham Lincoln, a great American, according to Martin Luther King. So we must ask ourselves, would Lincoln agree? Sadly, it is difficult to answer this question. Martin Luther King continues, 100 years later, the life of the colored American is still sadly crippled by the manacle of segregation and the chains of discrimination. We already talked about the basic idea behind segregation, the idea of separate but equal. Let us for a moment reflect upon the chains of discrimination. Segregation was a legal phenomenon. Discrimination was also a legal phenomenon. However, it is, by definition, also a social or personal phenomenon. The chains of discrimination. We should ask the question, do these chains of discrimination bind colored America only? Or do they also bind those who discriminate against colored America? Many of the founders, particularly Jefferson, observed that slavery as an institution had a negative effect on the masters, the slave owners, the Americans who benefited from slavery. What exactly did they lose? According to Jefferson, they lost, we might say, their souls. They became corrupted. The relationship between the slave and the master corrupted the master. This, according to Jefferson, was a great danger for a Republican form of government, because a Republican form of government requires citizens who are not corrupted, citizens who are responsible. Again, another open question. Martin Luther King continues, 100 years later, the colored American lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Here, it is very clear that the material inequality between colored America and white America was of great concern. Rightly so, from the point of view of Republican thinking. Aristotle correctly noted that for a democratic society to function, for a democratic political government to function, there could not be great inequalities of wealth between the citizens. There must be a strong majority in the middle, a strong middle class. And if colored America lives in a lonely island of poverty, by definition, it does not live in the strong middle class. Therefore, here Martin Luther King does indeed speak in the tradition of Lincoln. He does not speak only of the misfortune of poverty. He speaks of the misfortune of a republic where a large segment of citizens live in poverty. Because if a large segment of citizens live in poverty, they will not have the ability, time, means to be of service to the republic. They will simply resent the injustice of their situation. This is a political fact. A political fact lost at the time, I think, to the proponents of segregation, who were not concerned with the problem of having a large segment of American citizens condemned by segregation to poverty. Just as the proponents of slavery were not concerned with the danger to constitutional republicanism posed by a vast population of slaves. Can you have a functioning republican democracy if there is a large population of slaves and a small minority of free citizens? Can you have a functioning republican democracy if there is a large population of colored Americans living in poverty? These are not only questions of human justice, they are questions of practical, political survival. 100 years later, the colored American is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. In ancient times, often the slaves were soldiers whose armies had been defeated, citizens of cities which had been sacked, They were aliens within the political community that took them into slavery. For hundreds of years, colored slaves in the colonies and later in the United States were born slaves in the colonies and later in the United States. They did not know any other land. It cannot surprise us then that a people born into slavery within their own home could threaten the political order governing that home. This was the great fear of many founders. This was the reason why efforts were made to limit slavery. This is why, when the Constitution was written, there was a prohibition of importing more slaves. The compromise made with the southern slave states, allowing them to keep their slave systems if they joined the Union, was a compromise made because of the hope that it is better to have the slave states in a new country founded on the idea that all men are created equal than to have a slave empire on the border of a young republic. These are difficult, unsatisfactory, yet necessary political considerations. And Martin Luther King here suggests that these considerations, 100 years after the proclamation of emancipation, still plague, still endanger the American Republic. So we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. This is a very important point that Martin Luther King makes. We wondered in the beginning whether Martin Luther King's radicalism was in keeping with Abraham Lincoln's pragmatism. It is a fair question because Martin Luther King himself says that he is speaking in the tradition of Abraham Lincoln, a great American in whose symbolic shadow King speaks. When Martin Luther King tells us that he has come to dramatize a shameful condition, this suggests that he understands Lincoln's pragmatism and Lincoln's language. Lincoln was able at the same time to dramatize a shameful condition while refraining from doing anything that would worsen instead of improve that shameful condition. And losing the slave states, letting the slave states create their own country, would have worsened, not improved, the shameful condition. Keeping the slave states, which is what Lincoln proposed to do, seems to be a hypocritical, cowardly idea until we realize that its alternative, an independent slave empire just south of the border of a territorially smaller United States, would spell disaster for the Republic and for any hopes of dealing with the slave problem. Dramatizing a shameful condition is an admission that the condition requires dramatization, that it is not self-evident, even if it should be. The whole idea of dramatization is to increase, to elevate emotion, the passions, to let them play center stage for a moment and put reason to the side. This is, of course, a dangerous political game, but the alternative is to let the cancer grow unchecked. The alternative is a greater danger. And when Martin Luther King says that he has come with others to dramatize a shameful condition, I think it addresses the criticism of some of his contemporary detractors in American society who felt that he was just rocking the boat, making waves, making trouble. It is this American pragmatism which finds a practical way out of trouble that Martin Luther King seemed to stand against. But on the other hand, the stubborn insistence of a portion of American society, first, that there should be a large slave population within a republic of free citizens. Next, that there should be a large population of colored Americans living on a lonely island of poverty within a republic of free citizens. The stubborn insistence on maintaining both of these orders, first slavery and then segregation, is itself a case of making waves and rocking the boat of Republican political order. Because again, as Aristotle correctly taught, without a strong middle class, A republic cannot survive if a large population of slaves, a large population of impoverished people find themselves within a republic. That is a danger. Is it really worth maintaining this system? Is it not a cancerous addiction from a political point of view? In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. This is the famous, marvelous portion of this speech. The idea of the Declaration of Independence as a check. What is a check? A check is a promissory note, a promise of payment for work done. The whole idea of a check is based on trust, because you might say that a check is not justice. Socrates teaches in Plato's Republic that justice is to give others what they are due. A check is a promise that they will receive what they are due. It is not what they are due. And American society long functioned on the idea that checks are good. That if you get a check, it's good for the amount written in the check. And the Declaration of Independence is a check made out to we the people. When the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. These are weighty words. This is an idea that should weigh heavily on the conscience of good citizens. In a sense, they have come to cash a check. In a sense. It is a metaphorical idea. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, it is difficult to muster any political argument against this sentence. I cannot see how Martin Luther King's opponents could possibly believe that the founders, who were careful with every word they wrote in the Declaration of Independence, Publius, the Federalist Papers, magnificent writing, careful writing, men who understood that history would judge every word that they put on paper, do you really think that when they wrote that all men are created equal, they did not mean black men? Do you really think that they did not mean humans, mankind? The etymology of the word suggests it, and the further writing, rhetoric, and action of so many of the founders suggests it. Martin Luther King is not reinterpreting this document. He is stating the plain language of this document, just as a day laborer is interpreting his check literally. The number written on that check is what he expects to get, because that's what it says, because that's the deal. And part of the deal, part of the language of the check, which is the Declaration of Independence, is that those rights are inalienable. What does the word inalienable mean? Well, to alienate, to make alien, means to push away, to make something which is ours strange, not ours. To alienate means that what is yours is no longer yours. Well, if the rights spoken of in the Declaration are inalienable, then no one, no person, no institution, no government, certainly not the government of the country that the Declaration declares to be independent, can alienate those rights. Of course, during the lead up to the Civil War and during the Civil War itself, a new interpretation of the Declaration of Independence arose. New ideas supposedly giving some scientific justification for slavery based on some supposedly scientific differences of the races emerged. And the arguments that the Declaration was speaking of a race, when clearly it was not. The founders, again, were very careful with their language. If the founders wished to clearly speak of a race, they would have clearly spoken of a race. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Obvious. Obvious is the same as self-evident. Well, this is a cold shower, to be sure. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 100 years of waiting to cash the check. This is what Martin Luther King is suggesting. He is suggesting that colored Americans have waited 100 years patiently waited to cash their check, to cash the promissory note of the Declaration. It is not unreasonable that he says that America defaulted on this promissory note. How many of us would wait 100 years for a check to be cashed? Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given its colored people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. Sacred obligation. Sacred is a word reserved for the divine. It is a religious word. It is something not to be taken lightly. Now, there is some notion in the United States of separation between religion and government, separation of state and church. Yet, this notion is not to be found in the Declaration of Independence. It is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. Does Martin Luther King suggest that there is a religious component to the American Republic? He must, if he is to call the obligations of the Declaration sacred. Or is he just dramatizing too much? Is he over-dramatizing? Well, the language of the Declaration is clear. The language of the Declaration refers to nature and nature's God. From the point of view of theology, nature's God is as much disattached as is politically possible from any specific existing religious tradition or order. And yet there it is. Why? The laws of nature and nature's God refer to a higher power. It is the idea that there is a greater law above any that human beings create. And we know from political philosophy that there is always a tension between the imperfection of civil law and the perfect ideals of the laws of nature and nature's God. We know that any attempt to perfect the civil law is a dangerous utopia. But any attempt to divorce the civil law from the laws of nature and nature's God, that is a practical dystopia. And so Martin Luther King here again is betting on the conscience of his listeners. Senator Barry Goldwater wrote a book, The Conscience of a Conservative. The idea of a conscience suggests the possibility of guilt. Martin Luther King is here attempting, I think, to make Americans feel guilty. He is not asking for anything more than what America promises to its citizens. He is not introducing an alien idea. He is not introducing a radical innovation. He is not overturning the American political order. He is simply telling Americans that they have overturned it because they have instituted and tolerated the existence of segregation and the chains of discrimination. They have defaulted, which is embarrassing. Americans don't default. There is nothing more embarrassing than insufficient funds, because that means that you are irresponsible. And one thing that unites all Americans is the desire to do a good day's work responsibly. And one thing all Americans expect is for their paychecks to be cashed. Martin Luther King is telling the nation, you have defaulted on your check. This is perhaps a slap in the face, but I think it is meant to be a cold shower. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. This is rhetoric at its finest. It is basically asking Americans, you aren't un-American, are you? You do believe in America, don't you? We come to cash the check because we believe in America. Do you believe in America anymore? We believe you do. We believe that the Bank of Justice is not bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So again, this rhetoric, this piling on, you can almost sense the tension in the listener, because let us try to imagine those who listened to this speech and who were not fully aware or did not fully agree with the drama of the situation that Martin Luther King expressed or conveyed in this speech. Here they are thinking, I'm listening to a dangerous troublemaker, someone who is rocking the boat and making waves, disturbing the peace. And yet, all he is doing is saying, the emperor has no clothes. You all think the emperor has clothes, but the emperor has no clothes. And now the question, the political question is, does the good citizen convince himself that the emperor is not naked because that is the only way to rescue the honor of the emperor? Or does the good citizen speak the truth, that the emperor is naked and should put some clothes on, because otherwise the emperor dishonors himself? That is the political question. That is the real political debate between Martin Luther King and those who at the time believed that he was a dangerous radical. Don't rock the boat because it might sink, versus rock the boat because we're heading into a storm. We need to change course. We need to get back on the original course that we promised to follow. That is the debate. That is what this speech is about. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and security of justice. I'm just here to ask for what you promised, America. That is what he is saying. He is not a radical. He is not here asking for more than what America promises to give. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. What is the fierce urgency of now? Well, the radical demands everything be done now. This demand is often impractical, silly even. Is Martin Luther King a radical demanding that everything be done now? Or are Americans who refuse to fulfill the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence the radicals who insist that the work of the nation should be deferred because they have their comforts, they have their priorities, they have better things to do now. And sure, all of those ideals in the Declaration of Independence, well, we can do that later. Who is the radical here? Who was the radical? The apologist for slavery who insisted on this radical institution being allowed to survive and prosper and cover an entire continent within a republic, knowing that a republic cannot exist with a small population of free men and a huge population of slaves. Who is the radical? The apologist for segregation, who understands that a large population of poor colored Americans is a danger to a republic which requires a large middle class. Well, if the Declaration of Independence did not exist, if the founding documents did not exist, if America was not America, maybe Martin Luther King would be the radical. Certainly in a slave empire or in a nation founded on the idea that some are created to rule others, Martin Luther King would certainly be rocking the boat. But is he not just warning of the storm that the boat is heading into, because it is off course? The fierce urgency of now, I think, is not Martin Luther King's proposal to demolish or destroy. It is his warning of destruction on the horizon. There's an old saying, don't kill the messenger. Someone who sees the danger and points it out is not the danger. The danger is the danger. But we think that if we ignore or silence those who point out the danger, then the danger does not exist. This is not time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. All men are created equal, just not today, tomorrow, step by step. The inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness starting next week with life, and perhaps later liberty. We'll see about happiness. The Declaration of Independence does clearly state that there is a danger in overthrowing existing orders for light, transient causes. It clearly warns against the temptation of revolution, against the idea that the perfect is the enemy of the good, against the idea that just because a political community does not do the best job of ensuring what it guarantees, does not mean that it is automatically better to overthrow it. But when Martin Luther King says that this is not the time to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, is he telling us that we should overthrow something? No. He is telling us that something is being overthrown. He is not proposing that we overthrow the Constitution. He is not proposing that we overthrow the Declaration of Independence. He is not proposing that we turn our backs on the founding. He is not proposing that we should not save the Union as Lincoln desired. He is proposing that we should do all of those things that the founders and Lincoln set out to do. The tranquilizing drug of gradualism, in this case, is the idea that perhaps America shouldn't be created. Maybe we should give the king one more chance. Perhaps the Confederacy should be allowed to exist. We can establish diplomatic relations with them, and they can go ahead and take over all of the continental South and Southwest and create a slave empire that stretches as far as the eye can see. Nothing bad will happen to our little republic then. Well, you see, when we are talking about the survival of a political community, you cannot be in favor of gradualism. Gradualism can only be practiced by the strong. Gradualism can be practiced by something that has a great capital behind it. Money to spend, time, resources, territory, the loyalty of a large citizenry who do not feel like aliens and who are not slaves and who are not poor, but who feel at home, happy and rich, and therefore willing to protect and serve their political community. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. Well, so here we have a call to action, we may say. But this call to action is rooted in a gamble that Martin Luther King will succeed in shaking the conscience of Americans. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Segregation was a compromise, not unlike the Missouri Compromise. There have been many compromises in American history, the aim of which was to secure peace and public order. Not at the expense of justice, but, so people thought, using a clever strategy to guarantee justice in a different way, separate but equal. In the times leading up to the American Civil War, there were apologists for slavery who would make the argument that they're just taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. They are doing their Christian duty. This idea of seeking for a compromise in fundamental matters is suicidal. We can seek a compromise about where or if we should build a bridge in a local town. Neighbors must constantly seek compromise to live together peacefully. The whole idea of toleration is, at base, a compromise. I do not like what they do, what they say, but I will tolerate them, and they will tolerate me. And you will say what you say, and I will say what I say, and you will do what you do, and I will do what I do. It is a compromise, because the alternative is nasty, brutish, and short. Is segregation a compromise? It was separate but equal a compromise? Or was it a ticking time bomb, just as slavery became a ticking time bomb? Because when the compromise of the Constitution with the southern states was made, the momentum, the dynamic was for the abolition of slavery state by state. Not all at once, but over time. There were no great voices apologizing and defending slavery. No one was calling it a moral good. No one that I can remember. No one of great note during the founding era. Yes, the founders had slaves, but they were embarrassed, not proud of it. And you might say that this is not enough, that this is little, this is ridiculous. But in the time leading up to the Civil War, you actually had statesmen and people of some political stature in the South claiming that slavery was a moral good. And now, when Martin Luther King speaks, you also have a segment of the citizenry claiming that segregation is a moral good, not only a temporary compromise. The momentum and the dynamic seem to suggest that segregation is here to stay. And let us be very clear that while slavery was a violation of human rights, segregation was a violation of the rights of American citizens, because colored America, as Martin Luther King called them, were American citizens. The slaves were not American citizens. They were human beings, and the Declaration of Independence does not speak of citizens, it speaks of human beings. But certainly, to be both human and American means that not only do you enjoy inalienable natural rights, but you enjoy inalienable civil rights. That is the logic. Who is the radical here? Martin Luther King or the segregationist? The person insisting on American law and the ideal of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America being put into practice, or the people insisting on the opposite? Who is the radical? Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Well, please note that here Martin Luther King does not say that we should lift our nation from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of racial justice. Brotherhood has no racial connotation. Segregation has a racial connotation. Segregation, a system based on separation of human beings based on their race. Brotherhood, a concept where race disappears. Now is the time to make justice a reality to all of God's children. Again, the concept of race disappears. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment and to underestimate the determination of its colored citizens. Well, please look at how this sentence is constructed. Is Martin Luther King a radical who is threatening America with chaos and disorder? Or is he, like Aristotle, simply observing a political fact? If you underestimate the determination of a large part of the citizenry who are unhappy, the consequence for the political order is very negative. You may not like this information. You may prefer to kick the can down the road, but again, don't shoot the messenger. This sweltering summer of the colored people's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. Now again, that is an observation. At best, we can quarrel or critique or disagree with Martin Luther King's political predictions. But is he inciting a rebellion? Or is he making an observation about a political fact? If political facts are ignored, there will be political consequences. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Here, Martin Luther King again squarely puts himself in the tradition of Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation was not the end, but the beginning. 1963 is not the end, but the beginning. Perhaps the end will come when it is no longer necessary to remind people of the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps the end will come when Americans are no longer surprised to discover what America means. those who hope that the colored Americans needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. This language cannot be a clearer example of observation and reporting a political fact. Martin Luther King here is not representing or advocating or encouraging rebellion, radicalism, dangerous excess. He is warning America of the consequences of ignoring political facts. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the colored citizen is granted his citizenship rights. Citizenship rights. This is why Martin Luther King not only mentions the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution as well. He is not simply claiming the natural rights of man. He is claiming the very concrete civil rights of American citizens. He is, in fact, asking America, are you a serious political community? Do you take seriously American citizenship? Does citizenship mean anything? How can an American citizen be denied the rights of a citizen How can race be more important than citizenship? Aristotle defined the citizen as one who has political power. The citizen is one who has political power. How can we say that the race of a citizen is more important than the citizenship of the citizen? The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. This is a very dangerous political fact, because the bright day of justice, of course, will never emerge fully. That is the nature of political life. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. Some could believe that this means that we must quickly progress towards the bright day of justice. But it could equally mean that we must learn to navigate the whirlwinds of revolt, which shake the foundations of the nation. In practice, that is political life. And what Martin Luther King is doing in this speech is he is showing an example of, let us call it, the citizen statesman. I say citizen statesman because Martin Luther King did not fulfill any political duty within the American government. He is not a statesman who is elected to office or nominated to some post, but he is a leader of opinion and, in a sense, a kind of statesman, the citizen statesman who points out the direction of the ship. The idea of citizenship assumes that one does not need to be in office to influence the course of political events. One simply needs to convince people of something. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. And let's think exactly what the argument here is. Because the argument is not, do some people have a right to refuse service to colored Americans? The argument is, do some people have the right in America to refuse service to Americans? Do some citizens have the right to refuse the rights of other citizens because of their race? Again, it is a question of which is more important, American citizenship or race? When you put the question that way, when you stop looking for a moment at the issue as being one of denying someone or turning someone away or treating someone worse because of their race, and make it simply an issue of denying someone or turning someone away who is an American citizen in America. Now, it seems that if one group of American citizens can be denied their citizenship rights for whatever reason, well, it's not hard to imagine any American citizen being denied their citizenship right for whatever reason. Martin Luther King did not come to ask for some special privilege. He came as an American citizen to ask for the rights of citizenship. Is he not an American citizen? Are colored Americans not American citizens? You see, this is why I think Martin Luther King's political rhetoric was so effective, because ultimately his challenge to America was a challenge on the basis of the rights of a citizen, not the rights of a colored man. We cannot be satisfied as long as the colored person's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. Aristotle, the middle class. I know I repeat this over and over, but there is a tendency sometimes to consider only the immediate question of the responsibility of individuals for themselves. And we can discuss as a separate issue, a separate question, to what extent certain individuals perhaps could do more to take responsibility for themselves and their communities. But that does not change the political fact that if a large community exists within the republic that is poor, impoverished, whose social mobility is limited to moving from a smaller ghetto to a larger one, the very fact of ghettos, islands of poverty, in a republic is a dangerous fact. Only a strong middle class, only a large majority of citizens in a strong middle class can guarantee that a republic will function and survive. So Martin Luther King, speaking of this issue, it is not simply a matter of some type of economic justice or individual responsibility. It is not simply a matter of those people living over there. You cannot have a republican form of government. You cannot have a democratic society which allows for the existence of islands of poverty and ghettos. They are incompatible with each other. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating, "For white only." Well, some Americans need not apply. Again, we have to keep in mind that Martin Luther King is claiming the rights of an American citizen. His claim is not based on some unrelated foreign idea that he brought with him from some other place to disturb America, which has nothing to do with these strange ideas. He is an American citizen claiming the rights of citizenship. We cannot be satisfied as long as a colored person in Mississippi cannot vote and a colored person in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. This is very interesting. The first part of this sentence now seems quite self-evident. The second part seems prophetic. It is a high standard. The idea that there is no difference, that it does not matter who you vote for, that there are no great moral, political, practical discussions taking place, that there is no large issue to decide, that it is all just show and lights. Should we be satisfied if anyone believes that they have nothing for which to vote. Should we be satisfied with the quality of our republic if that is the case? No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Well, this is a reoccurring theme in American history, is it not? In each time of great turmoil, in each time of great danger to the Republic, Americans have had to express their dissatisfaction. And while it may be a dramatization, an over-dramatization to imagine that justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, it is still a matter of political necessity that if a republic is to survive, the citizenry must confront the problems as they are. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of your trials and tribulations. So now he is speaking to those who have directly suffered, for whom the problems are not an abstraction, but are something that they face on a daily basis. And again, it is the luxury of those who do not face these problems on a daily basis to be able to calmly discuss them, as I am doing now. It is a political fact that those who do not have such a luxury will be radicalized, and the danger to the Republic magnified the longer the problems exist and the more the problems lead to polarization and radicalization. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by storms of persecutions and staggered by the winds of police brutality. This is a language which certainly does dramatize. But the question is, what is more dangerous to the Republic? Dramatic language or the drama of persecution and brutality? Do not kill the messenger. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Creative suffering. It is a sad necessity in political life, I suppose. Gentlemen are defined by their ability to recognize when they have lost an argument. They are defined by their ability to listen and admit when they were wrong. To be chivalrous in defeat, to be magnanimous in victory. Creative suffering is something to be avoided in political life. If it is necessary that citizens suffer creatively, this is a sign of danger. This is a sign of a sick republic. A republic unable to argue maturely and to resolve differences reasonably. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Well, certainly the inspired language of religious romanticism is nothing new. It is something that reoccurs in American history, and it is also something that is very natural to a democracy. But both creative suffering and unearned suffering, if they exist in a republic, are signs that the republic does not function as it should. Citizens should not have to suffer, whether creatively or unearned, to make a political point. We should all be reasonable enough to simply be able to discuss things and accept differences while seeking that which is common. Yet Martin Luther King here is speaking to those who do not have that luxury, to those who seem to have been pushed into unwanted radicalism. What I mean by unwanted radicalism is when something which you think is normal suddenly becomes heroic. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our modern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Well, the fact that slums and ghettos exist in modern cities has not been changed. Aristotle, a strong middle class, is necessary for the survival of a republic. Slavery and poverty are political dangers. You see, it is not enough to simply say that some win, some lose. Everybody should take responsibility for themselves. Both of these statements are true, but it is also a political truth that you cannot have a republic if modern cities become slums and ghettos, and if there are vast islands of poverty inside of your republic. Just as you cannot be a republic if there is a vast slave population inside of your republic. And we should remember that these are some of the reasons why republics were thought of as impractical. If we look at history, we realize that the architecture of the United States, from a historical point of view, is laughable. And for a long time, in its infancy, at the beginning, Europeans would routinely expect the United States to collapse or fall apart because the whole idea was silly. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. Well, certainly that is good advice. And I think you can see, I hope, from my interpretation of this speech, that my goal has been to demonstrate the political realities and the political challenges that face a republic that does not understand the dangers of which Martin Luther King here speaks. I say to you, my friends, we have the difficulties of today and tomorrow. Well, this is a good statement because the difficulties are tomorrow as well. If someone wishes to claim the rights of citizenship, they must acknowledge the duties of citizenship. One of those is to recognize that the difficulties will continue to exist. There is no perfect justice. I still have a dream. Well, so on the one hand, we have the difficulties of today and tomorrow, and on the other hand, we have the dream. This too is in keeping with the political tradition of Abraham Lincoln. The excellent statesman always has one eye on the practical realities of today and tomorrow, and the other gazes at the ideal. This is why statesmanship is misunderstood often, because it appears to be an act of hypocrisy. How can you be a practical idealist? Isn't that contradictory? Well, politics is contradictory. You might as well not have any democracy or any republic or any citizenship if you wish to have an ideal government, have a king, have a dictator. It is perfectly bad. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. Well, is it not? So you see, again, if we wish to accuse Martin Luther King of rocking the boat, we must ask, what boat is he rocking and why, if at all? Is he disturbing the American Republic? Or is he preserving the American Republic? Is his dream not rooted in the American dream? Is the American dream a bad dream? Should we not have an American dream? I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. There is no country on earth at this time which has a creed. Countries have traditions, countries have civil or religious laws, but there is no other country which has a philosophical creed at its center. There is no other philosophical kingdom where philosophy is the king. The Declaration of Independence is America's philosopher king. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. To argue against this sentence is to argue against America. You can do it. You can claim a different creed, but then you are the radical. Then the burden of justifying your revolution lays on your shoulders. Martin Luther King is not the radical. He is not a revolutionary. I have a dream that one day, out in the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Very important, that sentence. There is no mention here of vengeance. There is no mention here of an accounting. There is no mention here of sitting at a table where one who was the master is now the slave, and one who was the slave is now the master. There is brotherhood. Because that is what the idea of equality in America is all about. You cannot have a republic if the citizenry is divided into camps seeking revenge from one another. It is impossible. If revenge is more important for you than America, so you will have revenge, but you will not have America. That is what Martin Luther King is telling us here. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. Is it un-American to hope that Mississippi will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice? Does it bother the people of Mississippi so much to require of them to hope that they will be an oasis of freedom and justice? And certainly we cannot have any doubt at this point in Martin Luther King's speech what he means by freedom and justice. Freedom and justice in this speech clearly mean exactly what the Declaration of Independence defines them as. In short, what he is saying is he has a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi will be American. It is almost strange when put that way. It is perhaps insulting to those who think that, but we are. What are you talking about? Are you saying we are not? That is what he is saying. He is saying that you are not living up to the ideals of America. Well, it is like an Old Testament prophet, right? In the Old Testament, the prophet would always come to blame the people for turning away from the divine law and say things to them that they did not want to hear. So here we have America's prophet. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by their character. Well, people have a tendency to judge others based on many things. But judgment, making a judgment, how do we judge? These are questions that demand that we ask ourselves whether the different conventions of judgment are legitimate, or whether perhaps there is a natural standard of judgment universal to all people. We can judge someone based on the color of their skin or how they are dressed, or we can judge them by what they do, by their character, by how they carry themselves, how they conduct themselves. Action is a reflection of moral and ethical ideals. Character is reflected in action, not in something which has nothing to do with your mind. Character is connected to your mind, to thinking. I think at the end, we can simply leave the remainder of this speech without comment. Let us say that the ending of the speech speaks for itself. So that's what we'll let it do. And I invite everyone to comment and share your thoughts about this speech. And of course, I am interested to hear what you think of my interpretation of it.